Let me just say a brief word about Hillsdale, which is a campus I've never visited. One of the things I do at the Wall Street Journal is I hire our annual intake of summer interns. We call them the Bartley Fellows after the late, great Robert Bartley, the longtime editor of the Wall Street Journal. And we get about 200 applications, overwhelmingly from Ivy League schools. And every year I hire 5 people, and typically from the pool of 5 every other year we will hire 1 person to join the staff of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. And the last person we hired for this position was a young woman named Kate Batchelder, class of 2013. So I've come to know about Hillsdale not only because she's an enthusiastic alumnus of the place, but because she probably typifies, certainly exemplifies, what seem to me the virtues of the school. She writes extremely well, she thinks deeply, she cares about first principles, and as a result she's capable of connecting the dots because she knows where the dots are to begin with, which is not necessarily true of graduates of other schools whom I encounter. So I just want to commend you, and there must be students scattered here and there, Hillsdale students in the audience, either at the Kirby Center here in Washington or back in Michigan. The Bartley Fellowship, it's the best summer internship on the planet. It's hard to get into, but I run it, so let me urge you to apply, because we need smart young people, and they are in incredibly short supply. Also, because one of the things I've discovered in writing my first book is that you are your own book entrepreneur. Of course, I commend my book that comes out in November. I have a wonderful blurb from George Shultz, who still very much has his mind beautifully intact, well into his 90s. He had only one, he said, it's a great book. He said, the problem with your book is, the book is titled American Retreat, the New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. So I signed the contract for this book 2 years ago. He said it should be called the Current Global Disorder. But because of publishing schedules, that train has left the station long ago. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is the foreign policy divide in the GOP. And this seems to me a much more worthwhile topic than talking about the foreign policy divide in the United States. I have a colleague, Holman Jenkins, whose columns I commend to your attention. He writes the Business World colleague. But Holman has a wonderful line. He says, there are certain arguments that vanish in the presence of thought. And having arguments these days with my friends on the Democratic or progressive or liberal side is to have an argument which vanishes in the presence of thought. Yes, we will strike a deal with Iran and the Iranians will keep their side of the bargain. Yes, we will reset relations with Russia because after all, what the Russians want most of all is to be integrated into a modern economy led by the United States and the European Union. Yes, we will have a progressive relationship with the Chinese because the Chinese, after all, are interested in a peaceful rise in East Asia and the rest of the world, and so we needn't bother about the fact that they are silently but very clearly attempting to take over the South China Sea. Yes, the tide of war is receding, and we are going to continue to do some more nation building at home because, after all, foreign policy and domestic policy are zero-sum games, and if we just extricate ourselves from these horrible places in the Middle East and the rest of the world, we can focus on building a 21st century infrastructure and healthcare that's fit for everyone. These are not serious arguments. They're not interesting arguments. They're arguments that you have to wage, because as Ross Thomas once said, once you have all the fools in town on your side, you've practically won. But they're not intellectually interesting arguments, and so one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the GOP, the foreign policy divide in the GOP, is because it is an intellectually interesting argument, and it does raise first principles, fundamental principles, constitutional principles on either side of a debate that has been waged sort of sotto voce for many years, but is now coming very fully into view. And I would offer, to start these remarks, I would offer that 2013 was the year in which, if you will, the San Andreas fault within the foreign policy establishment of the Republican Party became visible. It was the year when it began to shake. We began to see that there were serious fundamental differences, and that both sides of this debate had politically substantive leaders, spokesmen, champions who were going to take these positions to the American people, to the Republican electorate, and make the case for them, in terms which all of us in this room, however you come down on it, would recognize as identifiably conservative, identifiably constitutionalist, identifiably in touch with the broad traditions of American foreign policy. What were those three events? In 2013, early in the year, the Republican Party had a fundamental debate about the virtues of the budget sequester. What mattered most to our national security? Was it a deal with the Democrats that would at least, start to bring down our overspending at the federal level at the cost of making sure that, at the cost of half of those cuts coming on the back of the military? Was that a sacrifice worth bearing? And that was an argument that divided Republicans very, very seriously. It was I remember when we were talking about it within the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, it was one of these times when two sides sort of emerged in a group that usually is in harmony on these basic issues. How seriously could you cut the defense budget? Could you take risks with defense at the expense of finances? Of course, I quote that line and I quoted it to some of my colleagues on the other side of this argument, because that line comes from Neville Chamberlain, who in 1938 said, I would take I consciously chose to take risks with defenses instead of finances. So there was this debate within the party on the merits of the budget sequester, and at the time, in early 2013, of course this is before the visible advent of ISIS, the invasion of Ukraine, threats to the Baltic states, and so on, the side that really won that argument politically was the side that was in favor of a budget sequester. Second thing that happened, and this was very striking, was the debate among Republicans on Edward Snowden and what he had done. And you will remember that when Snowden defected to Hong Kong and then over to Russia, he did have very visible defenders, not simply where you would expect them in the ACLU and pages of The Nation and the New York Times and The Guardian and so on, but one of his defenders was Congressman Justin Amash from the state of Michigan, who said that Edward Snowden, he described him as a whistleblower. Rand Paul, senator from Kentucky, said yes, Mr. Snowden had broken his oath to his employers, but on the other hand, he also had an oath to the Constitution, and he compared Edward Snowden to none other than Martin Luther King Jr. He said that what Snowden had done wasn't a betrayal, wasn't treason, it was an act of civil disobedience. And I think that within some quarters of the Republican Party, in fact, growing quarters of the Republican Party, that feeling was widely shared. There is polling to show that now an absolute majority of men in America who self-identify as Republican are telling pollsters that the United States is going too far in suppressing civil liberties. This poll is from 2013, but it's an interesting thing to imagine that the same Republican Party that only 10 years ago had an Edward Snowden emerged back then would almost surely have been in lockstep in condemning what he had done as an act of treason or espionage or betrayal, that suddenly what he had done was at a minimum dividing the party. The person who brought the suit in federal court to end the metadata collection program of the National Security Agency, this is the collection of telephone metadata, what phone numbers place calls to what other what other phone numbers is none other than Larry Klayman, a very active figure in the Tea Party. So this was a second major debate happening just months after the budget sequester debate. Again, it showed visible fault lines within the thinking of the Republicans. Are we a party that is fundamentally about civil liberties, about privacy, about keeping a high wall between what the state can see and do when it comes to our private lives and our private business? Or is security integral to what we mean by civil liberties? Isn't, in fact, security the fundamental civil liberty, after all? Because if you don't have security, if you haven't solved the problems that Hobbes had to solve, you can't get to the problems that Locke then had to solve a few decades later. And the third debate, which was quite interesting, was the debate following the attack by Bashar Assad's forces in Damascus using sarin gas or some other kind of chemical weapon that led to the death of at least 1,000 or so civilians. And this, again, was a fascinating debate on many grounds, one of which was a simple political debate. Can anyone seriously trust this president to be an effective commander-in-chief under any circumstances? But there was a deeper debate, for instance, the debate as to whether Congress ought to be consulted, whether Congress needed to authorize an airstrike to carry out attacks on Assad for, of course, ambling across Obama's notorious, infamous, and utterly erased red lines. Now, for 40 years, literally 40 years, the Republican Party and conservatives had made the argument that the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which had been passed against a politically crippled Richard Nixon, was not constitutional, that they did not believe in it, they would not honor it, that Congress did not, in fact, have to authorize every single military strike. Congress, after all, did not authorize the invasion of Grenada. Congress did not authorize the bombing of Libya in 1986. Congress was given 5 hours' notice by President George H.W. Bush that he intended to invade Panama. None of this disturbed conservatives or Republicans at the time, even though it rankled the kind of usual suspects in the liberal world, but something we were having this major debate about the legitimate extent of presidential powers as commander-in-chief against the obligations of Congress to be the body of government that authorizes or that declares wars. So 2013 turned out to be a pivotal year, and we started to see these fault lines beginning to emerge. And how would you define those fault lines? Well, if you're talking about a matter of budgets, I would say the debate goes between what I would call small government conservatives and big military conservatives. Now, there are people who believe in a big military for the military and small government elsewhere, and there are people who believe, vice versa, think that government should generally be small, but you have to make allowances, defense being a constitutionally legitimate function of government. But you can see these differences beginning to emerge, and nowhere more clearly than when Senator Rand Paul says, look, we have 750 bases around the world. Our military is in 130 countries. We are bankrupting ourselves in adventures overseas when we should be marshaling our energies, because after all, you can't have strength abroad unless you have strength at home. Now, I happen to note, and I'm going to tip my hand in this debate by saying that that is exactly what Barack Obama is saying, except Barack Obama wants to retreat from America's overseas commitments for the sake of big government, whereas Rand Paul wants to retreat from those overseas commitments for the sake of small government. But I think this nonetheless is a fundamental difference in this divide. Small government conservatives against big military conservatives. People who think that a large military is fundamental not only to America's interests, but also in some sense fundamental to America's identity. Now, there is also a moral component to this divide, and I would put the question this way. Is America fundamentally a land of liberty, or are we a nation of liberators? Are we a country, or are we a cause? That's an important question that we need to ask ourselves. It's a fundamental question. Are we a city on the hill that is principally interested in minding our own business maximizing our own liberties, showing what liberty can do. But in the words of John Quincy Adams, we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. We are the well-wishers of the freedom of all. We are the vindicator only of our own. He said that for his July 4th Independence Day address in 1825, which was the first year of his presidency. And by the way, to all of you with kids, make them know dates, because if you know dates and if you know who was president when, you'll be able to connect those dots. Dates matter, information matters. Don't look it up on Wikipedia, have it at your disposal. So, are we a land of liberty? Are we the land of John Quincy Adams? Or are we a land of liberators? Is our identity really not simply on battlefields like Gettysburg or Bunker Hill, but also at Checkpoint Charlie and Panmunjom? Does that identify, is that the core of our identity? The country that went abroad and proved that it was the last best hope on earth, not only for ourselves, but for others, who brought freedom to South Koreans and tried to bring freedom to the Vietnamese, who made sure that Europe didn't crumble in the aftermath of the Second World War, that continues to defend vital and embattled democracies like Israel and Taiwan. Are we that country? This is a fundamental question. So land of liberty or land of liberators? And this seems to me also to be an important dividing line between the two sides in this debate. And again, I should say these are difficult questions. I'm not trying to offer you a sort of a facile, false, Obama-esque false dilemmas here. Do we want to steal from Aunt Sally, or are we going to be a nation of nice people? This is kind of debate at the level of Obama. Sorry, that's an aside. Then there's an ideological component, which is, are we essentially, what is our worldview? Is it what comes to be known as a kind of isolationist or neo-isolationist, or are we internationalists or neoconservatives? One of the things that I tried to do in this book, because the title, The New Isolationism, is in it, is I think it's important, not that I agree with it, but I think it is important to give the isolationists the intellectual respect that they are due. Because it was not an insignificant movement. It is not an insignificant tradition, and it is not a stupid tradition. It is a fundamental tradition. One might even say it is the default tradition of American foreign policy. George Washington says, the great rule of our conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. That's George Washington in his farewell address. Thomas Jefferson says, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all, entangling alliances with none. Robert Taft, as late as the early 1940s, and then again after the war, said, for many years the leaders of this country and every party have asserted that America should never go to war unless an attack is made on this continent. Now this is somewhat amusing coming from the son of the man who was at one point the Governor General of the Philippines. Somehow we did that. But what I'm trying to say is that this is a serious intellectual tradition. And if you look at, for instance, who composed the America First Committee, which is now derided as this horrible committee, who was on it? Sinclair Lewis, E.E. Cummings, Potter Stewart, the future Supreme Court Justice, Gerald Ford, future President of the United States. So this is a tradition that deserves a measure of respect. And not only it deserves a measure of respect, not least because I think that when the United States does not face extraordinary, pressing international circumstances, it's who we want to be. Isolationism expresses a certain kind of Americanness. And so we have to think about it as a serious point of view, and not just as a kind of a parochial or prejudicial point of view. And against that, there's this other tradition of internationalism, which has essentially been, if you will, the foreign policy that dare not speak its name. Because America has, in fact, been going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, from the Barbary pirates all the way up until the pirates in Iraq and Syria right now, and many enemies in between. It's just that we are we pretend or we tell ourselves that this is not really, the real American tradition. So that's another question that needs to be faced. And finally, there's a question of what is really the threat to the United States? Ask yourselves this: what is a bigger threat to America today? Number one, the prospect that Iran will get a nuclear weapon. Number two, exploding federal deficits or state and city bankruptcies. What's the bigger threat? I don't know what the answer to that is. You would obviously answer, well, they're both big threats, but what is the bigger threat? These are the sort of questions that I think are important to ask if we are going to begin to grapple with having a serious foreign policy. And if we are going to be able to come up with foreign policy solutions that begin to make sense and make sense for us now in light of where we have been in the last 20 years. Let me talk a little bit about the foreign policy moment that we are in, okay? After, in 1988, actually January of 1989, George H.W. Bush gave an inaugural address, which is really worth reading. It's one of the better inaugural addresses I think ever given, probably because Peggy Noonan wrote it, but that's another story. Someone at the Wall Street Journal had a hand in it. But he said in that speech, "The day of the dictator is done. We know what works. Freedom works." And that was a very apropos thing to say in 1989 when it was clear that the Soviet Union was collapsing, when it was clear that the people in Poland or in Hungary or throughout Eastern Europe were yearning for freedom, that the collapse of the Berlin Wall was just a few months into the future. And then throughout the 1990s, this seemed obvious, the thesis that we had reached an end of history, not as a question of events, but as a matter of ideology, in which there was common agreement that the only sustainable political formula that worked or could work for man was liberal democracy. This was sort of the shared conceit of most Americans, people around the world, Democrats as well as conservatives. And so we began to pursue a new kind of foreign policy in the United States. We were no longer pursuing a foreign policy that was about keeping nightmares at bay. During the Cold War, our greatest nightmare was a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. So our entire foreign policy was organized around how do we make sure that we don't have a nuclear exchange with the Soviets and at the same time don't allow them to essentially conquer our allies or conquer the world. Cold War foreign policy was about keeping nightmares at bay. Suddenly, after 1989, foreign policy becomes how do we make our dreams come true? Well, two very different things. So Bill Clinton begins to pursue a foreign policy based on the concept of the peace process. The idea that if you just bring Bill Clinton into a room, all reasonable people will agree. That, in a nutshell, was US foreign policy for almost a decade, extraordinarily enough. That America, American goodwill, American money could essentially bulldoze the way to get past misunderstanding, past conflict. So you had a peace process in Israel, a peace process in Northern Ireland, you had a peace process that Susan Rice engineered between Eritrea and Ethiopia, worked out great. Another peace process in Liberia, in which she brought in Foday Sanko into government. This is, by the way, sorry, this is an aside, but the National Security Advisor of the United States once engineered a peace process which brought a man whose principal business before entering this peace process was hacking people's arms off and gouging out their eyes to be vice president of a country. This was, this was Sierra Leone, not Liberia. Anyway, she's now the National Security Advisor, but that's another story. So you had this foreign policy from Clinton, and then you had the Bush years. And in a sense, much of the Bush doctrine reflected the premises, the philosophical premises of the Clinton years. Why was that? Because Bush believed and said in his second inaugural address that it was possible, it was the policy of the United States to end tyranny in every culture in our time. And I would submit that the common premise is a Rousseauian premise. Rousseau tells us that man is born free and yet everywhere he is in chains. So it simply is the policy of the United States to go around breaking those chains, the chains that Saddam Hussein had imposed, and the chains that the Iranian regime had imposed. There was more commonality between the Clinton doctrine, the Clinton foreign policy, and George W. Bush's foreign policy, at least in the freedom agenda sense, than most people recognize. This was a foreign policy about making dreams come true. And so we had this extraordinarily ambitious foreign policy. And you saw it play out when it came to the war in Iraq. Now, what was the problem with the war in Iraq? Well, there were two possible reasons to go to war in Iraq. Number one was to make an example of Saddam Hussein, to say, this guy is a serial lawbreaker who, if he doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, will certainly want to get weapons of mass destruction should he be given the opportunity to do so. He's invaded all of his neighbors, he's terrorized his people, and it is the goal of a great power like the United States to insist that at a certain point enough is enough, that we will make an example of Saddam Hussein, and we will make an example of him not only for the sake of Iraq, but for all the other dictators around the world. And notice, people say, well, we never found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But Muammar Gaddafi gave up his weapons of mass destruction program exactly 5 days after Saddam Hussein was pulled from his spider hole in December of 2003. So that was one reason to go into Iraq. You might call it the Cheney Doctrine. I'd like to rehabilitate it at some point in a future column. And then the second reason wasn't to make an example of Saddam Hussein, it was to make Iraq exemplary. And so we won the war in Iraq in 3 weeks at a cost of 139 American lives, and then we spent 7 years trying to make Iraq a pluralist, tolerant, multicultural, multi-denominational democracy with so many women in the parliament, freedom rights for all. And that turned into a 7-year fiasco. So because we went from a foreign policy that began as an act of making sure nightmares can't happen, and ended up becoming a foreign policy of trying to make dreams come true, that we came to grief. Instead of trying to be the world's policeman, we try to be the world's priest. Priests are in the business of saving souls and changing hearts. The policeman stands right there. He reassures good people, he deters people who are tempted to do evil, and he punishes the wicked. I would offer to you that distinction is a distinction worth keeping very much in mind. Now, what are some of the other foreign policy temptations for the Republican Party, for the GOP, for conservatives? Well, one is realism. Now, this is realism with a capital R. This is realism as it's practiced by Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft and Jim Baker. And this is a defensible, interesting, worthwhile concept, theory, idea for American foreign policy. Henry Kissinger was an interesting Secretary of State. The Nixon administration achieved interesting things when it was in office. The good thing about realism is that realism understands that in international relations, power is the coin of the realm. You want to talk about what Obama's foreign policy problem is in a single sentence? He thinks foreign policy is a popularity contest. He's the guy who said, hey, I just won American Idol. Why isn't Putin giving me a record contract? This is his foreign policy. Look, I'm popular. I'm not George W. Bush. So therefore, all foreign policy problems melt away. Everyone likes America because everyone likes me. And then when that didn't work out, he had no plan B. If you want to understand part of the vacuum of American foreign policy is that this administration remains in shock that it's no longer popular. And there's nothing beyond that. It's like a beauty queen who loses her crown. So, sorry for the digression about Barack Obama. These things kind of come over me, and this is how columns end up being generated. So realists understand that in foreign policy, power is the coin of the realm. That's a serious and important point to note in foreign policy. A realist would agree with Machiavelli's maxim that when it comes to foreign policy, the best thing to do is to develop a reputation, as Machiavelli put it, to be a firm friend and a thorough foe. Wonderful way of understanding. If you do nothing else, follow Machiavelli's maxim for foreign policy, and you'll have a pretty decent foreign policy. The Obama doctrine, by the way, is to be a terrible friend, right, to our friends, and to ingratiate ourselves as much as we can with our enemies. But this is not what I'm here to talk about. I'm talking about the GOP. But the problem that you have with the Kissingers, with the Bakers and Scowcrofts, is this. Raison d'etat no longer works in politics the way it used to. Why? Because we have a democratic politics, and in a democratic political system, the people demand a certain kind of moral accountability in their foreign policy. So the kind of cold-blooded realism that a Kissinger might have practiced or a Baker might have practiced negotiating with an Assad or a Mao Zedong, I don't think can work in the 21st century. It can't work in an era when you have instant cell phone feeds to whatever the Assad regime may be doing at any given moment in Homs or Aleppo or one of these other cities. So the realism that Kissinger extols in his books, and it's fascinating, the realism of a Metternich or a Palmerston or a Bismarck simply doesn't work in this century. Then there's what I call the faux realism, fake realism of Rand Paul. You might see a political drift, as I say, in some of the comments I make. Rand Paul spoke at a Heritage Institute event, and he said, "I am neither an isolationist nor a neoconservative. I am a realist." Now, Rand Paul is a guy who also says that he's a Fourth Amendment conservative. Now, if you're Henry Kissinger, or I don't want to pick on Dr. Kissinger, but if you're a true realist, and you have a situation where you have to take a Predator drone and smoke someone in that table because he's an Al-Qaeda terrorist and maybe kill the people around him because it's a successful political action, you will do that, even if we're in a private hotel in a private ballroom in the United States. Because moral considerations aren't what matter to the true realist when it comes to the practice of international politics or the safeguarding of national security. If you're a Fourth Amendment conservative, of course, that doesn't work because it's a violation of basic constitutional rights. So on his own grounds, Rand Paul's notion of being a realist betrays a total ignorance of what the concept of realist means. He also likes to say, well, you know, I think that I would be a president, or we need a president, a foreign policy president, in the mold of Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower has suddenly been reinvented in Rand Paul's imagination as this very reluctant practitioner of American power. Now, Dwight Eisenhower is the guy who came to office warning North Korea that the United States would nuke them unless they settled at Panmunjom. He was part of the coup to overthrow the socialist Mossadegh government in Iran. A year after the Mossadegh government, he overthrew the Arbenz government in Guatemala. He sent 14 or 15,000 Marines into Lebanon. When President Eisenhower came to power, the United States had 2,000 nuclear bombs in its arsenal. By the time he left power, we had 18,000 nuclear bombs. The first nuclear submarine, the first ballistic nuclear submarine, the first supercarrier, the first nuclear supercarrier, the first ICBM, all of our tanks, the B-52 bomber, which is still in our arsenal, the U-2 spy plane, which is only now being decommissioned, all of that comes from Eisenhower. Eisenhower, astoundingly, is remembered as the man who warned against a military-industrial complex. He is the man who created the military-industrial complex. So again, I would only say to Rand Paul, by all means, study Eisenhower, follow Eisenhower, just know what Eisenhower actually did. So this faux realism isn't really a worthy foreign policy, but it is worthwhile studying up on what the real realists are about. And seeing what they can contribute. And then there is a foreign policy school, which is what you might call a real neo-isolationism, or straight-eyed isolationism. And this is also a foreign policy with a real Republican tradition. Warren Harding, it's interesting when you think about it. When people think, what is the best historical analog for Barack Obama? People say, oh, he's terrible. Carter, Hoover, James Buchanan. Think about Warren Harding. except for the womanizing part. Here is a president who emerges from the opposite party, and what is his promise to the American people? Normalcy. It sounds a lot like nation building at home. It sounds a lot like the tide of war is receding. This is a president who begins the process of withdrawing the United States from the world after a predecessor from the opposite party who had crusaded for the United States on also somewhat utopian principles. If George W. Bush has an analog in foreign policy, it's probably Woodrow Wilson. Barack Obama, it's probably Warren Harding. What does Warren Harding do? What is his signal foreign policy achievement? It is the Washington Naval Treaty, which restricted the size of the US Navy to various respective tonnages. What was Obama's signal foreign policy achievement, in quotes, during his first term? It was the New START Treaty with the Soviet Union, restricting strategic nuclear arms. Then we have Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is an interesting figure for American conservatives. He enjoys a vogue in many respects. I was reading Amity Shlaes's excellent biography of Calvin Coolidge, in which she says somewhere, if I can only find this quote, I can't, because I can't read my own handwriting, but Coolidge basically spent his days trying to figure out how to fend off requests from the Army to deploy more planes to the Panama Canal and for the Navy for a new battleship. That was Coolidge's foreign policy. It was minimizing the US military for the sake of deficit reduction, paying off wartime obligations. And then you had Herbert Hoover. And what was Herbert Hoover's great achievement? Well, there was the Washington Naval Coolidge did something else. He also signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which outlawed war forever. A historian once remarked, a wonderful Scottish historian, and I hope the Scots remain in Britain, a historian once remarked that only in the age of Prohibition, when Americans had convinced themselves that they could abolish the evil of drink through legal fiat, could something like the Kellogg-Briand Pact come into being, where Americans could also convince ourselves that we could abolish war by legal fiat. So that was the other Coolidge administration achievement. And finally, you had Herbert Hoover, whose Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, had the bright idea when he discovered that the State Department had a cipher-breaking or a code-breaking operation. He shut it down with the immortal line, "Gentlemen, do not read one another's mail." Sounds a great deal like the push among civil libertarians today to shut down the metadata collection efforts by the National Security Agency, because a great country like the United States should not be reading or listening in on Angela Merkel's phone calls or so on. Mutatis mutandis, very much the same thing it is today. So these are the sort of alternatives that we are beginning to look at throughout the world, and all of them are failed alternatives. What should be the right solution? What is the Goldilocks prescription for an American, a truly conservative foreign policy going forward? Well, let me read you a quote from an American president, and by the way, lollipop to anyone who knows who, I don't have a lollipop, but an honorary lollipop to anyone who gets who said this. Which president? Our true choice is not between tax reduction on the one hand and the avoidance of large federal deficits on the other. It is increasingly clear that no matter what party is in power, so long as our national security needs keep rising, an economy hampered by restrictive tax rates will never produce enough revenues to balance our budgets, just as it will never produce enough jobs or enough profits. Who said that? You see, I have no tricks with you guys. John F. Kennedy in 1962 at the New York Economic Club. JFK, people understood that you don't necessarily have to make a choice between small government and a big military, so long as you understand that our defense budget is an essential function of the federal government, and that our security or rather our prosperity at home is underwritten by security abroad, which understands that a free trading, prosperous world in which countries like Russia, Iran, and China are not tempted to challenge America because America's power is overwhelming, that is part of what makes for our prosperity. That a big military is central to prosperity, that security is central to civil liberty. These are the sorts of things that people need to understand. Our problem with a big government doesn't come from too much military spending. We spend a smaller proportion on our defense today than Jimmy Carter did when he was president. In fact, George W. Bush spent a smaller proportion of GDP on defense, about 5.1% in 2008, than Jimmy Carter did when he was president in 2000. So we can begin to at least find some common ground between small government conservatives and big military conservatives, understanding that foreign policy and domestic policy are not a zero-sum game, that security abroad means prosperity at home. The second thing that we need to do is understand that our goal is not to redeem the world. Our goal should be to police the world. Now, what does it mean to be a world's policeman, and what is the most effective method of policing the world? Well, in 1982, two great American political scientists, and I know it's astonishing to think that you can be great and be a political scientist, but two really great political scientists, James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, wrote a very important article in the Atlantic magazine. You can find it on Google. It's called Broken Windows. I commend it to your attention. And there they observed a theory of social order. They noticed that if a single window in a neighborhood is broken, pretty soon every single other window in that neighborhood will also be broken, unless that window is fixed very quickly. What they understood is that crime in America wasn't happening because of root causes, poverty, broken homes, bad schools, racism, one sort of theory after another. It was happening because the mere appearance of disorder fosters a deeper kind of disorder. Even criminals tend to be social conformists. When they realize that no one's looking, no one's in charge, anything goes, they'll act. But if they feel that someone is in charge, that people are looking, they'll conform. It's a brilliant idea that you don't go from the bottom to the surface. You go from the surface to the bottom. You go from appearances to deeper things. And so they had this, what they called the broken windows theory of policing, which was that the goal of the police wasn't to react to crime, the fundamental goal. It was to preserve the appearance of order. And the appearance of order had to be preserved not necessarily by prosecuting every rape and murder, although you had to do those things, but it was by prosecuting the small things, what they called the social incivilities. Kid jumps a turnstile, pees on the street, spray paints a subway car with graffiti. These were the things that were causing crime. These were the things that were driving honest people out of cities and inviting bad people into cities. And they understood this. So they write this article in 1982. 12 years later, an American mayor named Rudy Giuliani reads this article and says, this sounds like a good idea. And New York City went from having 2,500 murders a year to having under 400 murders a year. It was the most astonishing form of social regeneration that we've ever seen in modern American history, all thanks to two great political scientists who had a bright idea. Now, there is a broken windows theory for the world, and this should be the essence of a conservative foreign policy. And what is that? Well, in September of 2013, Bashar Assad gassed his own people. There was an American red line, and we did nothing. It is not an accident, comrades, that within 6 months, Vladimir Putin was seizing Crimea and invading eastern Ukraine. The connection between Syria and Ukraine is not causal, it's environmental. There was one broken window, so someone decided to break the next broken window. And it's worth asking ourselves, who will break the third broken window? Who will break the third window? Well, ISIS, you can say, already broke the window that was called Iraq. The Chinese are going to become more aggressive in the South China Sea. They nearly brought down an American surveillance plane just a few weeks ago. This is going to be happening around the world because there is a sense of disorder. So we need an American foreign policy that understands that the goal for America is to be the world's policeman because there is no substitute to us. If you don't like being the cop, you're going to like it less when Vladimir Putin is the cop, or the UN is the cop, or the Chinese are the cop. We are the cop because there is no other cop, and you don't want to live in a neighborhood without a policeman. We want to understand that the job of the policeman is not to go around walking into people's homes saying, fix your life, stop drinking, be a better person. There are other agencies and other institutions that may or may not do that in the fullness of time, but that is not the job of a serious foreign policy. The job of a serious foreign policy is to set some baseline rules that reassure your friends and scare your enemies and make sure that when those rules are broken, that there are consequences for it, and not just consequences in the form of a UN resolution or Barack Obama giving a speech in Brussels, which is this president's idea of consequences. That there are real consequences for them. That violations of order are punished and punished consistently. I just want to finish very briefly by just offering you one thought, because after all, I'm really here to sell my book to you, which you may pre-order on Amazon already. But let me finish with this. What a conservative foreign policy can do is maintain global order in a way favorable to the security and prosperity of our friends, watchful of the ambitions of our adversaries, and mindful of the need to keep the countries caught in between, states such as Kuwait or Ukraine or Vietnam, tilting toward us. Conservative foreign policy is in the business of shaping habits of behavior, not winning hearts and minds. It announces red lines sparingly, but enforces them unsparingly. It is willing to act decisively or preventively to punish or prevent blatant transgressions of order, not as a matter of justice, but in the interests of deterrence. But it knows it cannot possibly punish or prevent every transgression. It champions its values consistently and confidently, but it doesn't conflate its values and its interests. It wants to let citizens go about their business as freely and easily as possible, but it knows that security is a prerequisite for civil liberty, not a threat to it. Where it can use a finger or a hand to tilt the political scales of society toward liberal democracy, it will do so. But it won't attempt to tilt the scales in places where the tilting demands all of its weight and strength and endurance. It does not waste its energy or time chasing diplomatic symbols. Its ambitions do not revolve around the Nobel Peace Prize. It prefers liberal autocracy to illiberal democracy because the former is likelier to evolve into democracy than the latter is to evolve into liberalism. It knows the value of hope and knows also that economic growth based on enterprise and the freest possible movement of goods, services, capital, and labor is the best way of achieving it. And it is mindful of the claims of conscience, which is strengthened by faith. But it has no messianic ambitions of its own. It prefers predictability to transformation. The change it seeks and promotes is evolutionary. Thank you very much.